around bias, others are interviews that I've done, and one is a webinar. So there's a whole variety of clips here for you to learn more about unconscious bias. I'd love to know what stirs up for you as you watch this, whether you understand what it is that I'm saying and how it has impacted you. How unconscious bias is killing your ability to choose. There's an old Chinese proverb that says, "A fish is the last one to know what water is." A fish swims and breathes in water. While water is essential for its life, the fish is oblivious to this fact, taking its environment for granted. But more than this, the water shapes a fish's entire life. Unconscious bias operates in a similar manner. Unconscious bias is the tendency an individual has to privilege certain people and ideas and dismiss others. Bias unconsciously shapes our lives and decision-making in three ways. First, it limits the scope of the choices we have by confining us to what is comfortable and by reinforcing an unwillingness to consider alternate options. Second, it hampers the clarity we need for making decisions by clouding our thinking and introducing irrelevant constraints. And third, unconscious bias undermines the values we hold dear as it works against our conscious belief systems and privileges compromise. Unconscious bias limits our scope or range of choices by confining us to what is comfortable. Choices are so much easier to make when we stay within the boundaries of what is familiar. Our individual comfort zones are broadly made up of the people we identify with, plus the ideas that we consider acceptable. The people we associate with and the ideas we align with are in turn largely determined by biases which are formed unconsciously and to which we pay little, if no attention, until someone or a life event challenges them. Because challenges ask us to step outside these parameters and become uncomfortable, we are less willing to consider options that are new or different. In this way, our choices are narrowed back down to what is known and secure. For the most part, these thought processes that determine whether we consider the new or stay with the comfortable are unconscious and rarely questioned. Bias also hampers our clarity in decision-making because it clouds our thinking. We believe we see things clearly and that we are objectively open to all available options. However, we all wear lenses of various shades. These different hues are formed from our life experiences, what we learned as children, and our cultures. Just as a person who is born with poor eyesight is unaware that they don't see clearly until they get a set of glasses, so our biases unconsciously cloud our ability to make clear decisions. We are unaware that we don't see things clearly. One way that blindness happens is that biases introduce irrelevant constraints. These constraints may be a person's nationality, their language or faith background, or even their gender. These factors are not necessarily bars to someone's ability to do the job, but unconscious bias based on externals rather than looking at all that a person or an option has to offer means that our decision-making abilities are hampered. Finally, unconscious bias undermines our cherished values by working against our conscious belief systems. Working on Nauru with asylum seekers was when I first became aware of the water I was swimming in. I realised that I had a subtle fear of these men with different skin colour, different faith and different language to myself. A latent racism made itself known to a woman who would have said she didn't have a racist bone in her body. When bias from our water remains unexamined, we can compromise our values as we choose the easier route over the one that aligns with our values and challenges how we see ourselves. We stay within our comfortable situations and boundaries rather than taking an active step out into the unknown. As I confronted my latent racist bias, I learned to embrace difference, seeing it as an asset rather than a threat. Unconscious bias is such a restrictive force in our lives. As it limits our scope of choices, it hampers the clarity with which we make decisions and undermines the values that we hold dear. However, once we're aware of the water we swim in, we can choose to leave it behind. What are some of the ways you've found for addressing your biases and leaving your water behind?
My name is Bronwilliams. I'm a commentator and facilitator on bias and diversity. And I have with me today Anita Bentata.
Hello.
How are you, Anita?
I'm great, Bron. It's great to be here talking with you.
And just so that our audience has a better understanding of what you do, can you tell us about the work that you have been doing over quite a few years?
Yes, I've been in the field of psychotherapy and counselling as a psychotherapist for 25 years. And through my own personal journey and that of working with so many clients and engaging with so many people all around the world, I really focus on how we have involuntary responses that limit our choices and our perceptions. And so to me, I call it the greatest freedom. In every given moment, we have the greatest freedom and infinite potential to access choices and transcend what is our past or what is happening in our current life. And I've seen amazing results in my own life and that of my clients when we can go beyond what our logical left brain tells us is what's going on.
Wow, Anita, and just as you're talking, my brain is going zing, zing, zing as I'm connecting the dots between what you're doing and what I am doing, because I think when we we obviously first met via LinkedIn, and then we took that connection into the real world because we both live here in Melbourne, and now we're back into the internet world again because of the coronavirus, but the connection remains. And I know when we first met, we found so many points of connection. So it's been wonderful to journey the last couple of years with you. Now,
Yes.
The conversations that I'm having are all around bias. They're bias conversations. And for me, the area of bias has actually bubbled much more to the surface while globally we've been facing the coronavirus, because I'm seeing the biases of so many different people in different areas, whether it's politics, just ordinary interactions, are really becoming obvious to me. And so I thought we'd start off our conversation today by asking you, Anita, what do you think bias is?
It's an interesting question because, yes, when I was talking, I was getting that zing zing too about both of our approaches and work. And for me, bias as a psychotherapist, because I specialise working with the unconscious, is very much associated with those experiences that cloud what we see, how we label things and limit it. And so it creates a repetition when we're biased. To me, bias it's very fixed and static. It's not flexibly responsive. It's not inclusive. And that, my understanding, happens when we don't have certain skills and resources to have the emotional muscle to step outside of what we already know to expand that. And so for me, biases is very associated with, in psychology speak, like working with complexes and working with, and also working with our involuntary stress response, because it then makes everything more limited and more urgent instead of being more curious. So yeah, I see those defenses as being very aligned with a sense of bias.
That's interesting that you use that word defenses, because that to me has been my observation, is that when we are operating out of our biases, we become very defensive. We want to defend a particular viewpoint or a particular way of doing things, a particular outlook. And we do get really defensive, and that shows itself, and this is probably where I've seen it mostly at the moment, is in the things that we say.
Yes.
The things that I've been reading on Facebook, the comments that I've been hearing, and because I'm attuned to bias, I hear the words, but then I also go, oh, look at what's happening underneath all of this.
Yes, and for me, defenses is a huge passion of mine, because they're involuntary. They get activated when we have a certain level of stress, and it's there to inhibit us from being with emotional pain or unbearable thoughts, unthinkable thoughts, unbearable feelings. And so we've got this automatic defense system. And one of the things I'm really passionate about is teaching people, there's an actual map of how the defense system works. That's it's simple to understand, but most people, including therapists, if they haven't had training beyond their basic qualification, they're often working with the defenses and trying to get people out of the defense, rather than recognizing you've got to work with the anxiety that's triggered the defense, that you've got to work with those unthinkable thoughts, unbearable feelings, and also to be able to look at what evoked that anxiety. What is it that is natural, your natural instinctual response? If you weren't having that anxiety, what would you be activated, motivated, be instinctually moving into if you didn't have that anxiety defense pattern? That's just, so when you get your anxiety down and you know what instinctual behavior you're not tapping into, then you can explore what's blocking that and get that free. And then the defenses don't happen, because you've got far more curiosity and a sense of sureness in your system, that emotional muscle that I talk about. So you can be okay to step outside your familiar zone.
Yeah. And look, that's so interesting that you talk about that anxiety and the defenses. When I shared my keynote, which I call What's Your Water, because I base what I do around the Chinese proverb that says a fish is the last one to know what water is. So introducing the concept of that our biases are unknown, just like the water is for fish. And I shared my experiences of working on Nauru, and how on the very first day that I worked there and we went down into the camp, I had this literally a gut reaction. And there was this rumbling underneath my ribs. And I came, as I reflected on that, I understood that was fear. And it wasn't because the men in the asylum seekers were going to hurt me, but just because they were different. They had different languages, different faiths. And as I shared that, one of the women who were listening to me, she said, "Thank you so much. You have now told me what it is that I feel," because she has had those like physical reactions in her body, but she wasn't able to give a name to it. And I know, I think both you and I are really seeking to raise people's awareness of what is actually happening in their lives, why they are responding to the stimuli the way that they are, and then how I love what you say about operating out of our greatest freedom, because for me, I know from my personal experience how much freer I am now that I've come face to face with some of my biases. I've had to own them, and that's not a pleasant journey, because often they tell us things about ourselves that we don't particularly like. But once we do that, the freedom that is there, and we can flip it on its head, because I have now gone from seeing difference as a threat to difference as an asset, and seeing how can I embrace other people's differences and learn from them, and the whole world opens up.
Yes, absolutely. And one of the things that I talk about is that in our society, we're very left brain focused, which is very black and white, very logical, very just what you see, very concrete. And we're not as connected to our right brain and the body. And the right brain really has a strong connection with the information from the body, just like you were talking about in Nauru. When we have those sensations and feelings that are in the body connects to the unconscious. So the unconscious is always sending us information, but we've lost the art of being able to listen to our whole self and gather that information and use it. And so for me, one of the things when we get that information, where we often get tripped up, is that we become overwhelmed about what we do with it. And that whereas as a society, we don't have adequate skills to be able to notice it, name it accurately, because a lot of people mislabel things. I see that in my practice all the time. But also how to transition out of that into that greatest freedom, because people often loop up because they're stuck in that left brain understanding of how to engage with something. So yeah, I just love letting people know there's easy ways. They're just unfamiliar because it's the way our society works. Is it's like a different language, but you can learn the language, and it is a language that naturally your body lets you know this feels good, and so it creates a desire to keep practicing that till in the neural pathways of the brain that becomes the most frequent, most recent pathway. Because right now, because the brain goes to what it's done most recently and most frequently, we tend to be with our bias, with our fear responses, with our defenses. And that's in those neural pathways. They're really well worn in those grooves, and we're just sliding in them, reacting from them. And it takes a little bit to create new neural pathways, but you feel so much better. So yes, that's a bit about how I understand a bit of what you were sharing.
Oh, good. Thank you so much, Anita. One of the things that is becoming increasingly obvious is the power of story and power of personal experience in helping, not only helping ourselves understand what's going on, but helping other people understand and make sense of the world. And I've shared a little bit about my experience with bias. Do you have an experience or a story that you would be happy to share, either like me, where you've had to confront your own biases, or maybe whether you have been on the receiving end of someone else's bias and how that impacted you and how you responded?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd really love to hear your input when I'm sharing this story, because what comes to mind for me as to, do you name that as bias? So yeah, just to see where we both sit. Straight away, I guess I go to what brought me into the field of psychotherapy. I was living in domestic violence, and I'd grown up in a childhood of a lot of trauma, neglect and abuse. So for me, there was a bias that you don't actually talk about what's really going on. There was a bias of you've got to put on this smile on your face and act as if you're okay when you're not. So I grew up learning to act as if what was not safe was safe, what was not lovable, and who appeared and felt for me not loving, act as if they are loving. And so that put me in a predicament when I was a young woman, because I was at a party and I met this man and I didn't like the look of him. But from the bias from my childhood, I couldn't show that. And there was such a strong bias to don't show anger. I'd been sent lots of messages verbally and non-verbally about don't be angry. And so I was in a difficulty because I couldn't tell him, just go away, stop following me around the party, because I had to put on that bias of nothing's bothering me, I'm fine, I'm happy to talk with you. And so I ended up in domestic violence, and we had a child together, and then later I escaped. And it took a lot to unhook myself from those childhood and from those adult experiences. So there, I guess, the two most significant bias experiences, and his bias about how I should be,
Yes.
how I should look, how I should speak, how I should serve him, and how I should not have my differences, my own beliefs, my own power. And so that's what really propelled me into the work that I do to help people to not get caught in patterns and only realize something when it's big.
Yeah.
It's like to be able to shift it sooner and quicker.
Oh, thank you so much, Anita. That is a very powerful story. And yes, because see, I define bias was when we privilege one group of people or a set of ideas over and against or to the detriment of another group of people or set of ideas. And what you have shared firmly for me falls into that the area of this set of ideas. You had been taught as a child, you were given a set of ideas about what was safe and what you had to do, and how you were to behave.
Yeah.
The man that you ended up marrying also had his set of ideas that he privileged, that was around what it meant to be a man, what it means to be a woman, what that looks like. And all of those messaging comes at us so early in life, and we absorb it long before we're cognitively aware of what is happening, and we don't question it. And even like from what you've shared, even as a young adult, you weren't yet able to question whether the set of ideas that you had been given as a child was actually helpful or healthy.
Yes, I had just so much anxiety and fear, and I had already a bias towards what other people were thinking. I was disconnected from my own thoughts and feelings. One, because it was too unbearable what I was feeling and I didn't know what to do with it. So I disconnect for it and focus on everyone else. But also because I'd had so many verbal and non-verbal messages to focus on everybody else. And so I had this extreme bias about revolving around other people, which didn't set me up for a good thing. And so even though I knew things weren't right as a young adult, I was intelligent, there wasn't any modeling around me of how do I get out of this. And it was like I had to get to something worse to then go seek help, because when I escaped, the first thing I did was go into therapy to make sure I never got caught in that again. And so then I learnt so many incredible skills that have made such a difference for me, that it led me to this thing that I often say is, we all got taught how to cross the road or do up shoelaces and do up buttons, but we weren't taught how to be with our own brain and our own involuntary responses. And so it's irrespective whether you've been in a toxic relationship or not, we've all been limited by something in our life, person or situation, and we often find that shapes us on how we perceive ourselves or being in the world, or what's possible. And so from living with power over me from my parents in a not helpful way, not what we developmentally need, as well as from the relationship I was in, it's really got me passionate to teach everybody just the basic life skills that we didn't learn. They're vital.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most amazing things about the journey of life, is that we have the opportunity to learn from the experiences that we have, and then to be able to share that. And so as we bring this this conversation to a close, is there anything that you want to add just at the end, maybe around what can we do with our biases? or how can we mitigate the risks that they bring?
Mm-hmm. I think it's really important that we're kind to ourselves, because when we
Yes.
judge
Yes.
ourselves, it just doesn't help. No one feels better when we're being judged, and we're usually our worst judge to ourselves. So to be kind to yourself when you've got, because we all have biases. It's just, it's natural. It's what you do with it that matters. And so to be able to be kind to yourself and to say to yourself, there's a reason why this originally developed. It didn't come from within me. My understanding is it came from outside of us and we took it in. And so anytime we have a bias, to be able to pause and go, there's a positive, there's a reason why this originally developed, even if I don't know what it is. And to be able to be just curious about what is it supporting in my system? Where am I feeling fragile or vulnerable or unknown?
Yeah.
And just to be curious to look at it from a different position, so it doesn't have to become this thing that you've got to fix. Because then I think it's like we've got this fight and polarity going with us. Yeah. And that's tricky. So to be able to go into a third position of just kindness and curiosity and allowing and just looking at what else is this bias connecting to.
Oh, thank you, Anita. Yeah, I was very excited when you said, to be kind to ourselves, because we are our own worst enemies. And I often say that our biases are like part of our DNA, because they formed so early in life. They're there and they operate unconsciously. And as we become aware of them, yes, to treat ourselves with kindness and to treat other people with kindness, and that we will revert to type. There will be times when we go back to our default positions and without thinking, but to just be kind, not judge ourselves because of what we see as a lapse or a failure, but, and just then decide, okay, these are my biases. I don't want to operate out of it. Oh, whoops, I've done it again. Okay, pick myself up. This is what I've decided I'm going to do, and just keep going.
And if I can just add that when we have a bias happen and we can be with it kindly, then we can become curious about what is this bias flagging that's missing for me. Like it's going to come up to fill a gap in our system. So it actually is a beautiful guide for us to let us know when we're out of the alignment of how we want to be in the world and in ourselves. And we can just become curious about what is this bias flagging, that's what's missing for me. What am I needing to access to that would mean that if that was there, the bias wouldn't be there. So it can actually help us grow more. So to just be able to appreciate and become curious about what our bias is wanting us to have access to.
Oh, I love that. That's such a wonderful insight. And so I think we will leave our conversation there, because that's such a positive place to end. So Anita Bentata, thank you so much for joining me here on Bias Conversations.
My pleasure, Bron. It's always wonderful talking with you.
Bronwilliams, I make bias conscious. In this video, I will be speaking to gender bias, when what you do screams louder than what you say. Most of us would be familiar with the old adage that actions speak louder than words, where what we really think and feel is seen clearly in what we do, regardless of what we say we believe. This is no more readily seen than the area of gender bias. The push towards gender equity has been advancing since the early 20th century, when women across the globe pushed for the right to vote. While on the surface, gender equity is touted as the norm, gender bias is still operating in many covert ways, three of which are bias in the voices we privilege, bias in the idea of promotion on merit, and bias in our jokes and language. I grew up in a conservative Christian tradition. I went to church every Sunday and listened to the minister give his message. The voices of authority in my formative years were all male. As an adult, I leaned into male conversations, convinced that they were more articulate and learned. As I studied for my degree, the texts recommended were primarily from male authors, with a token female voice thrown in for an alternate or fringe viewpoint. It took me decades to realise that I privileged men's voices and needed to begin listening to the voices of women. While I claim to support gender equity and gender equality, my actions in listening to the voices of men rather than those of women showed my true attitudes. Once we become aware of unconscious bias, we have the choice whether we allow it to continue to influence our lives and decision-making or not. The second area is bias in promotion on merit alone. This attitude is often loudly touted, but I question the validity of the merit alone claim. At the base of most organisations, the gender balance is fairly even. However, as the structure tapers, fewer women are in that middle and upper management level, and even fewer at board level. Those, both men and women, who argue for a promotion based on merit as valid alternative to quotas, fail to recognise that with men more readily promoted than women, we are communicating that women are less capable than men across many fields. And there'd be very few of us who would actually say that out loud. The gender bias towards men is embedded in the systems that support organisations. Gender bias is part of the very structure of corporations, which is not surprising given that business, science, academia, indeed most areas of endeavour, have been the playground of men for millennia. To truly support gender equality and combat covert gender bias, it's essential to address just how both systems and structures favour men and disadvantage women. A third way gender bias operates at an unacknowledged level is in the language we use and the jokes we tell. As a mother to 3 sons, I spent much of their teenage years telling them that just because something was funny didn't make it right. This was in response to their predilection for humour that was at the expense of others or which denigrated or degraded others. And it's not only men who use humour and language in this way. Women do as well, such as when we refer to each other as bitches. Language that dehumanises places barriers between people that are resistant to equality. We can't say we support gender equality and gender equity if we dehumanise others by the language we use or denigrate them by our humour. Gender bias is alive and well and functions unnoticed and unacknowledged in our language, attitudes and systems. Both men and women suffer from gender bias, and it operates in both trivial and important arenas of life. When our actions speak louder than our words with regard to gender bias, we are both complicit in its impact and responsible for its demise.
Thank you for joining me on this webcast for What's Your Water? Making Bias Conscious. I'm bronwilliams. An old Chinese proverb says, "A fish is the last one to know what water is." Now, a fish swims, lives and breathes in water. It is part of its very being. In a similar manner, people find it difficult to recognise their unconscious biases because they are such a deeply ingrained part of us, almost part of our DNA. And even when we do identify what our biases are, learning to work with them is an ongoing exercise, because I'm not convinced that we can completely eliminate our biases, but we can learn to identify them, We can decide what we want to do with them, and then we choose how we use them for our future growth. You know, I didn't know I was a fish. I didn't know I was a fish, not when I responded to the Salvation Army call for volunteers to go and work on Nauru in the Offshore Processing Centre back in 2012. I didn't know I was a fish even when I landed on Nauru into the tropical heat of a small Pacific island 30 kilometres south of the equator. I didn't even know I was a fish on that very first day. After being up for 24 hours, we walked down into the compound, into the camp, where over 400 men had been allocated to live, sleep in green army tents. I didn't know I was a fish. Even as I walked through the gate, I was disconcerted by the things that I was feeling as I wandered around with my group. You know, I did first start to think that I may be a fish when I was aware of a rumbling just below my ribs. It was at this time unnamed. But as the 4 weeks on Nauru for that initial visit progressed, and as I reflected on what I was feeling, I realised that that rumbling, that churning, was a fear. Now, it wasn't a fear of the men themselves. Like, you look at the people in this picture, they're often quite almost emaciated. I didn't have anything to fear from them physically, but I was afraid because they didn't look like me, they didn't have the same skin colour, they spoke different languages, they had a different culture and race, and they were of different faiths. I was afraid because they were different to me. You know, I really started to come face to face with my fishiness when I realised that that fear came from a latent racism. Now, I grew up in a largely white, monocultural, Bible-based, conservative area of Sydney. I didn't know many other people other than white people. And just growing up in that environment had built within me a latent racism. I was appalled, completely shocked, because I would have said I didn't have a racist bone in my body. But here I was, having to come face to face with my latent racism. And as I returned to Nauru, I came back twice after that, once more as a volunteer, and the third time in a full-time role. As I worked with the Nauruans on the staff, I came to realise that there was this subtle sense of superiority amongst the white expats. Somehow, because we were university educated, we come from a developed country, we felt, myself included, that we were somehow superior, that we knew better than Nauruans how to deal with this situation. When I sat down with one of the leaders of the Nauruan team working with the Salvation Army and I mentioned this to Fatima, she said, "Yes, we know that about you people, you guys, but we just accept it." Now, that was like a blow to my heart. I was utterly appalled because I didn't see myself in that way. I hadn't originally seen myself as racist. I didn't think I was someone who held superiority over others. And yet these two biases of mine just from the way I'd been raised, the way I grew up, the culture I grew up in. These were staring me at the face. And I realised I was pretty fishy, and I'd been swimming in the water of racism and white privilege my entire life. Now, I couldn't stop being a fish, but now I knew what my water was. I could work with it. You know, so when I did return to Nauru in a full-time role, I was the religious liaison officer, the only white shirt salvo on the island. Now, my role was to make sure that the religious needs of all the asylum seekers were met. So that meant people who were Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, Hindus, Zoroastrians. I had to find and source materials. I had to help them find ways of worshipping and praying. I couldn't show any partiality because we knew that supporting the religious needs of the asylum seeker community meant that their mental health would be much more stable. And so as I did that, and as I worked in a beautifully multicultural team on Nauru, we had people from the UK, the US, from Sri Lanka and Vietnam and India and Uganda and Ghana, and so many different languages, Persian, Dari, Vietnamese, Arabic, as well as English. I become to realise and appreciate that difference was an asset. It wasn't a threat. So yes, I could see difference, real difference, as an asset. And then as I've taken that ability to see difference as an asset rather than a threat, now as I work and have done with leaders in various sectors, I've discovered that raising awareness around bias leads to a greater capacity for broader thinking around diversity and difference, which then enables leaders to make better informed decisions that are pertinent to their work and their workplace. So, what is bias? Bias is the tendency to privilege a particular group of people or set of ideas to the exclusion or detriment of other groups or ideas. So bias is about saying, this is what I believe and this is right, and I don't want to think about something else. And we all have biases. So how does bias form? Well, bias forms unconsciously in childhood and our formative years via the input from family, culture, media, and other external sources. Now, I mentioned about my racism. I was not raised in a home that was overtly racist, but because I didn't mix with others, and my parents were of a generation where anybody who was dark-skinned was a native, there was this sense in which we didn't trust people who didn't look like us. So it was really subtle, nothing, my parents were wonderful people, but covertly I learned that white people are best and white people know how to do things, and we need to just ignore what other people are doing. So what are the impacts of bias? Bias impacts all the areas of our lives as it shapes how we view life. So bias sits there in the background, and because it's not conscious, it just works behind the scenes, shaping how we do things and the decisions that we make. It influences our decisions so that unconsciously, as a business owner, we might hire people who look like us. We don't consciously think, I'll only employ people who have the same skin colour as me, or people who are the same gender as me, or the same age as me. But we have these unconscious biases. They're covert and subtle, and they do influence the decisions that we make. Now, we would love to think that we're objective about everything, but the reality isn't that we're not. We've all got lenses on that we look through, the lenses of our culture, our age, our gender, our nationality. All of these lenses are biases, and we look through them and we make our decisions coloured by those lenses. So they influence our decisions. Biases also feed our fears. And that was, for me, became obvious on Nauru. I didn't realise I was afraid of people who were different to me like that until I was actually face to face with it. But the bias that I had unconsciously against people of a different skin colour was feeding that fear. That's why I could feel it, because I was actually in no physical, emotional or mental danger when I was on Nauru. Absolutely none. And yet the fear was there because my bias of latent racism was feeding my fears. And then it shapes our relationships. Now, I know that people laugh about, look, gosh, I'm a baby boomer and there are millennials and Gen Xs and Gen Ys and maybe even Gen Zs and whoever, there'll be a whole new lots of generations. And I listen to conversations from, say, my children's generation that have, and I hear bias in their conversations about my generation, but I also hear bias in my own generation against my children's generation. So it's not that none of us can do away with our biases, but it can actually influence how we look at people who are different to us, whether it's in relationship to generations, whether we treat men and women differently. I know I had a situation where I realised that growing up in a conservative Christian tradition, my most formative voices were those of men. I listened to the minister every Sunday. Men were in authority. They were the ones who told us what to do, what was the way of thinking about the Bible, all that sort of thing. It was only a few years ago that I realised I had a bias in favour of men's voices and their understandings and against women. And I had to make a conscious decision. Well, who do I listen to now? And I've made a conscious decision that I'm going to listen much more to women's voices. Not that I don't listen to men, but I need to right the imbalance. So it can influence the relationships I have with my learning. It can influence the relationships that we have with other people, those people that we work with, when we unconsciously privilege one group or one set of ideas over and above another. But we can use our biases to our advantage, because this woman here in the white shirt, who is speaking to you today, probably nearly, what are we looking at, 8 or 9 years on, I took my racist fears and my sense of superiority and chose to see difference as an asset rather than a threat. It stood me in good stead while I was working on Nauru, but it stands me in greater stead now as I work with people from all nationalities. I have relationships, close friendships with people who are not from a white Australian background. We can use our biases to our advantage as we choose to reframe the stories that we tell ourselves around our biases. So as we become aware of our biases, as bias is made conscious, we are more able to do 3 things. The first is we are able to listen with different ears. We all have these filters, our biases, that everything we input goes through. When we become aware of that water exists and that we have a particular kind of water that we're swimming in, we are then less ignorant of the waters that other people may be swimming in. We start to see and hear things differently. We understand some of the nuances that are at play in the conversations that we have. And we become aware of the undertones, the inferences, and the subtle implications of what is being communicated. We hear more than we previously did. Second, we have a deeper understanding of the power of meaning. We give meaning to everything, to events, occurrences, things that we've enjoyed, things that have gone against us. We are meaning-making machines. But we all see experiences differently, and we can see the same experience in different ways. Two people can experience the same thing, but attach different meanings to us. And sometimes those different meanings can bring us into conflict with one another. So as we realize that we bring meaning and that others bring meaning, we can have a better realization just how powerful that is. That can be powerful in our workplace as we listen to the meanings that come out in a group situation. Maybe more, it'll come out in a Zoom situation rather than an in-house meeting in this current environment. But we will be able to listen for that meaning and go, okay, this person is seeing this situation differently. What can I learn? What can I add? How can I draw out that person's meaning so we can add it to the conversation? And when we find ourselves in conflict with someone around the meaning that we've attributed to an experience or an idea, because we understand the power of meaning in each of our lives, we are able to not take their meaning personally as a personal attack. We are able to step back and, to a sense, observe that this person sees this differently to me, but can we find common ground? Or can I learn from them? We don't have to get into a tit-for-tat retaliation. And the third thing about that we develop as we become more aware of bias is that we are better able to manage incremental change. Everything changes slowly. We sometimes want to just jump out of our pond. You know, we realise we're a fish, we're swimming in a particular type of water. We think, well, maybe I could be a tadpole and turn into a frog and just leave the water completely behind. Now, we know that that's not possible, but we can choose to change ponds. We can choose the way we look at something. Because, you know, people only change when they see the value in it for themselves. I changed when I understood about my biases because what I saw did not fit with my view of myself. And so I wanted to change. As we seek to bring change into our workplaces with ourselves, we know that this is going to take time. If it's of value to us, we can communicate that value to others. But we also need to recognise that change, being incremental, we need to have patience with ourselves and also patience with others, because particularly if we're understanding maybe that a bias is at a structural or systemic level in our company, that bringing about change means we need to take everybody on a journey. We need to be able to communicate to our staff just exactly what these changes mean and why we're doing them, that we're not just doing them for change's sake. We have to help people see that this change is going to be of value to them. So, what's your water? Have you recognised, even in this short time that I've been speaking, that you are swimming in water? Have you perhaps even had a few murmurings in your heart, in your head, about what your own water may be? Have you been perhaps aware that you've experienced those rumblings just below your ribs and you can now identify that as fear? So if you'd like to find out more about what your water is and how you can leave the things behind that are hampering you, then I'd encourage you to let me know in the chats afterwards. We can take things offline. There's my email address, info@bronwilliams.com. Happy to get an email for you. I do have an email list in which I'm sending out information around bias, some practical tips for us personally and in business and work. So if you'd like to become part of that, please send me an email or let me know in the chat afterwards. So enjoy. I'm glad you've enjoyed this time with me, and I hope that you will discover what's your water. If you'd like to learn more about unconscious bias, just drop a comment or use the QR code and that'll take you through to my website. You'll see there that not only do you talk about unconscious bias, but I talk a lot to women about the power that they have. And that's one area that I'm really passionate about. So I'd love to hear from you, love to connect with you. Let's do that soon.